wanted to pause it.
And stop it. And if you want to zoom in, there's this little button up here at the top. Pull it down, it'll zoom in. And you just barely push it, or pull
You
it.
want it that close on you like that? Kind of get it something. Okay.
Yeah, however you want to, and if you want to
once.
change it up a little bit, and a little bit further back.
And we'll get everybody out here on this
Pushing it
side.
Makes it forward and
Everybody at
pushing
once
it down,
take their
pulls it
picture,
back.
and then we'll
No,
get
pulling it down.
Right
Zooms
in.
in.
So, if
And when you
everybody
push
will
up,
be right
it
out there, right
back,
outside the pavilion.
or far away. Oh, are we gonna?
We're gonna try to, let's welcome Scott here.
Right into the top. All right. Thank you, Wanda. Last week I saw Cousin June Brandenberger, and she asked if I was ready for my talk. And I said I've already forgotten all the stories because I researched this several years ago. And she suggested I go home and read the book again. So I did read a little bit of it again just to brush up on it. Usually when I give talks, I talk about Indian captives in general, that is children from the hill country captured by Comanches or Apaches. Or sometimes I talk about one of my ancestors whose name was Adolph Korn, who is one of the kids in the book. But today I want to do something different, partly because we are in Fredericksburg, and partly because I think there may be a McDougall connection. I'm going to talk about a kid who was captured on the river here in Gillespie County, just a few miles out of Fredericksburg near Morris Ranch. Does anybody know offhand who that is? Rudolph Fischer. Is one of the McDougall families related to the Fischers, and who is it and how? Y'all help me out.
I searched it and now I can't remember. So
Okay.
bring it.
He also the Radkes.
Yes.
Yeah. Fischer's brother-in-law was Otto Radke, who I believe was also connected to McDougalls. Okay. So we probably have a few people here who are related to the Fischers. Anybody else a Fischer relative, maybe through another family or another connection? No? Well, I hope there would be. Maybe not. He is one of the most interesting stories. You know, in this area we hear a lot about Herman Lehman because he wrote a book and he gave performances at the end of his life, and so many people know about him. Not nearly as many know about Rudolph Fischer, but he also had a very interesting story because he spent his entire adult life with the Comanches. And what is especially unusual about that is that he was already 13 years old when he was captured. Now, you know, a lot of kids who were taken maybe when they were 6 and spent several years with the Comanches had kind of forgotten about their first family, their birth family, and you can understand how they became Indianized. But it was very unusual for someone who was already 13 years old and kind of had his identity, his personality formed, to completely change to a completely different culture and take on the ways of other people. So in 1865, in the summer, Rudolph's father sent him out to look for some stray cows. Their farm was on the river close to what's now Morris Ranch. And some Comanche raiders were coming through the area. They saw him out by himself and they picked him up, took him with them back up to Indian territory. Of course, his family knew that he had been captured by Indians. They had no idea if he was dead or alive. That Christmas, his father actually wrote to President Andrew Johnson to see if the president could do anything to help find his son. Because when you think about it, if a kid was taken by Indians, it was very, very difficult to find out where he was. First of all, a lot of times the families didn't even know what tribe might have taken him. It could have been Comanches here, it could have been Apaches, could have been Kiowas, or even Kickapoos coming up from Mexico. So nobody really knew which tribe they were with. And the other thing is, you know, these tribes ranged over areas from the northern half of Texas, the western half of Oklahoma, part of Kansas, eastern New Mexico, just a huge, huge territory. So General Sherman had once said that, you know, trying to find a kid captured by Indians was worse than looking for a needle in a haystack. It was more like looking for a flea in a large clover field. But a year afterward, in 1866, there was a German trader named Marcus Goldbach, who periodically went out to the Indian camps in the Texas Panhandle or eastern New Mexico and sold goods to the Indians. And he visited a Comanche camp in 1866 where he saw this German boy. And of course, they could talk to each other in German. And the boy said his name was Fischer and gave his parents' names. And so this was the first that the Fischers learned that the son was still alive. Marcus Goldbaum, perhaps because they were both German, he felt very sorry for this kid and really wanted to get him away from the Comanches. And so he did everything he could to try to pay ransom, get the Comanches to let the kid go, and they were not willing to do that. So he left the camp very disappointed, but he wrote to the Fischers here in Fredericksburg and promised them he would continue looking for their son. He did that for 4 years. Every time he went out to an Indian camp, he would ask about the kid, he would look around, see if he could find Rudolph Fischer. And finally, in 1870, 5 years after Fischer had been captured, he found Rudolph again in a Comanche camp in the Panhandle. Now, keep in mind, by this time, Rudolph was 18 years old, and he had been living with Comanches for 5 years. Now, Marcus Goldbaum, the trader, was just overjoyed that he had finally found this kid after a 4-year search. The only problem was, Rudolph didn't want to leave. He tried everything he could to talk Rudolph into going back with him, and was not successful. So he reported back to the Indian agent, who was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, that he had located Fischer and could not persuade him to leave. Now, the Indian agents at that time were mostly Quakers. The Quakers, during President Grant, had taken over most of the Indian agent positions. They saw it as kind of a humanitarian role. And so the Quaker Indian agent did not know what to do about Rudolph Fischer, because he didn't really want to stir up the Comanches, taking him by force. And so he wrote all the way to Washington to ask, what do I do about this kid? So the agent wrote, they say he is married among them and not willing to leave. Will the department order that he be taken without his consent, if it can be done, without being likely to cause difficulty with the Indians? Now, the head guy in Washington, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, wrote back, it is perhaps not advisable to take any step for compelling the young man against his will to leave his present associations. But if it be possible, he should be seen and persuaded to return to his relatives and friends in Texas. Well, that was easier said than done. Rudolph Fischer by then considered himself a Comanche. He had taken the Comanche name, Asawena, which means gray blanket, and most importantly, he had married into the tribe and reportedly already had at least one child by then. So Rudolph Fischer stayed with the Comanches through their last years on the plains. He was with the same group as Quanah Parker, and he became pretty closely associated with Quanah. In fact, later in life, 2 of Quanah's sons married daughters of Rudolph Fischer. So the families had a very close connection there. And Rudolph Fischer fought with Quanah in the Battle of Adobe Walls, 1874, which turned out to be a major defeat for the Comanches. And after that, Colonel Mackenzie pursued them across the Panhandle until finally the next year, 1875, Quanah, Rudolph Fischer, and all of their groups surrendered at Fort Sill. And so that was the end of their nomadic life. So Rudolph Fischer is now living on the reservation at Fort Sill, and people start to notice he doesn't look like the other Comanches. They start asking him a few questions, and he admits to the Indian agent that his name was originally Fischer, but he claimed he couldn't remember his parents' name or where they were from. So the Indian agent put an ad in the Austin newspaper. Somebody saw it, they told the Fischers about it, and of course they were overjoyed because for years they hadn't known whether or not Rudolph was still alive. It had been 7 years since anyone had last reported seeing it. Well, Gottlieb Fischer, his father, wrote to the Indian agent at Fort Sill, said, yes, this is my son, please send him home. The Indian agent didn't move too fast. partly because, they had other things they were dealing with, and this was not high priority. And also partly because Rudolph was not particularly anxious to come back to Fredericksburg. And so they had a very hard time persuading him that he needed to go back and see his family. They finally did. His father traveled all the way from Fredericksburg to Fort Sill to collect him. And even then, Rudolph was not too keen on going home, but he finally consented to come back with his father here to Fredericksburg. He got here, his parents were overjoyed, all the newspapers wrote about it. It was a big story in Texas. Rudolph Fischer, 12 years with the Comanches, comes back to his family. He stayed here in Fredericksburg 9 months and was not very happy because by then he considered himself a Comanche in every way. His parents tried to get him to bring his wife and his kids here, but he didn't think they'd be happy. He didn't do that. He finally took a job for a local man who was getting ready to take some horses to Nebraska. And so Rudolph Fischer went along as a hand. They were out a couple of days, and Rudolph Fischer started getting very restless. The temptation was too great. He got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, discarded his white man's clothes, painted himself up, gave a Comanche war whoop, waved goodbye, and took off for Indian Territory. A year later, his father wrote to the agent again saying, "What's happened to my son? I thought he was just going for a visit. Why isn't he back?" The Indian agent wrote back and said, "Well, I told him he should go back. He said, 'Oh, I'm going out on a buffalo hunt. I'll return later.'" Kept making excuses. And in fact, Rudolph Fischer didn't return to Fredericksburg for another 21 years. So he bought a farm near Apache, Oklahoma. He became very prosperous. He married 2 Comanche wives. They were sisters named Tissachauer and Kachacha, was the younger one. In the late 1800s, he and his family converted to Catholicism, and the church told him he wasn't supposed to have 2 wives. So they discussed what to do, and they all agreed he would divorce the younger sister, Kachacha, although they did remain on good terms because when he was in his latter years, she did take care of him. His father died here in Fredericksburg in 1894, and of course part of the land was supposed to go to Rudolph, and he wasn't interested in it. He had his farm in Oklahoma, that's where his life was, his friends. But, the family here needed to get the estate settled, so finally his brother Arthur went all the way to Oklahoma and convinced Rudolph he needed to come back here so that they could settle the estate. So that was the year 1900, 6 years after his father died. He made his first trip back to Fredericksburg since 1879, or 8. So he had been gone about 22 years. He visited with his mother, visited with his family here. He sold his interest in the farm to his siblings, and then he returned to Oklahoma once again, where he lived a very successful life. He learned to read and write. He made sure all of his kids went to Catholic boarding schools, got a good education. And it wasn't until he was in his 80s that he started to take an interest in his Texas family again. In 1935, his grandson brought him here to Fredericksburg. They spent several days with the family of his brother Arthur. They hunted deer, they had a good time. At that time, Rudolph promised the Fredericksburg newspaper that he would write an account of his life that they could publish, and unfortunately he never did that. So very little is really known about his early years with the Comanches because he chose not to talk about it, even to his family. Rudolph's last trip to Fredericksburg was in 1939 when his brother Arthur died. He came here for the funeral. And then Rudolph himself died a couple of years later. He was 89 years old. And his second wife, Kachacha, took care of him at the end because his first wife had died before him. Rudolph Fischer had a very interesting life. Unfortunately, there's not much known other than what I've told today because he never wrote anything and never really even gave any interviews. Does anybody here have any stories about Rudolph Fischer that you heard growing up? I was curious if I might learn something new.
They're in the Williams family.
Williams family?
Schwartz. Who's here?
My dad would tell about him coming down to visit. He'd be driving in a big car, he said, big convertible, and his sons would drive him down and he'd sit in the back, flat brim hat, with his arms folded and come down to see my grandmother. And he would ride down and he said he'd bring him toys like handmade bows and arrows that the Indians had. Of course, the kids his age, you play with them, break them, throw them away, so he wished he kept them. But you can remember him coming down and some kind of oil or something on the reservation or some kind of oil money was involved in the riches he got. He was pretty well off.
Yeah, I didn't realize they had oil, but I knew that he was pretty prosperous. His life.
The time that he was with the Comanches, when they would raid and bring raiding parties down here, he would put a watermelon rind on a certain fence post so that my grandmother would know that they were in the neighborhood.
I had never heard that story. I did learn from someone in Hartford that apparently he did come back to this area when he was with the Comanches, and there's a story that one time he even went up to his parents' house to look into the window to get a glimpse of his mother, but he didn't stay. He went on back with the Comanches. But I never heard the watermelon story.
Four cheap barns and a watermelon rind on a certain fence post.
Anybody else know any stories? Anybody have any questions?
Wanda Parker was also half white, right?
Yeah, Juana's mother,
Cynthia
Cynthia Ann,
Parker.
was white, and she spent
Similar story.
24 years. She was taken when she was only 6, I believe, and spent the next 24 years with the Comanches.
She was a Nixon, right?
No.
What was her name, the girl that was taken by Wanda?
Cynthia Parker.
Huh?
His mother was Cynthia Ann Parker.
His mother.
Yeah.
Didn't he also kidnap a bride?
Juana?
Yeah.
I don't know. I never heard that.
Wow.
Okay.
I don't know.
Wanda Parker did not kidnap
He didn't?
him. He did remember.
Well, I think, but was she white?
Huh?
Was she white?
No, his mother was. She wasn't. She was mixed
I'm
as well.
confused.
Cynthia did the same kind of thing. When she came back, she pined away and died.
Right. She never readjusted either. And Rudolph Fischer is the only one I know of who really spent his entire adult life with the Comanches. You know, Herman Lehman went back and forth. He did live in Oklahoma for about 25 years, but then ended up coming back to the hill country.
What was the big deal? Why did they want to, why did the Comanches want to swipe a old German boy? What was it?
It's really Indian tribes throughout North America, taking captives was a custom. And it was, originally it was more economics, because the kids could either be held for ransom or traded to another tribe, either for money or goods. During the last years before the reservation, it's believed that the more important reason, especially for taking kids, was to build up tribal numbers. Because between like the 1850s and 60s, a large proportion of the Comanches had been wiped out either by disease or warfare. And so they felt that if they, got kids who were young enough, like usually 6 to 10, that they could be retrained and come to think of themselves as Indians and would fight for the tribe, which is pretty much what happened. And what's amazing to me about Rudolph Fischer's story is that a kid as old as 13 could go through that transformation. But yeah, that was the most important reason in the 1860s and 70s, was to build up the tribe.
Scott, does Rudolph have any descendants in this area? He had children, right?
Rudolph had many children, and I don't think any live in this area. I know they visit here periodically. I visited one of his granddaughters in Oklahoma, and she had been down here for a Fischer family gathering in 1996, and I think a few times after that. So they do periodically see the Fischer family here, but I don't think any of them moved here.
Were they any kin like the O.C. Fisher?
No, it was a different spelling. These were the Germans, Fischer, and I think his is just Fischer, isn't it? I think so. Yeah, I don't think they were the same family.
I don't know how true this is because I've told the story so many times, I don't know if I believe it myself. But my grandmother, she called her Zoodle, she was Elizabeth Sprinkle. She married Alonzo, and she lived with us about the last 10 or 15 years of her life. And when she get married, she would start cussing me out in German because I was pretty Russian. But she told a story about her when she was a little girl living in the Bronx, and that men, all the German men were out farming in the field. And she said at that time, Cibolo was a Comanche campground. And said that the two Comanches came over one day, raided, stole a whole bunch of the children, and took them back to Cibolo. And when all the men found out about it, she said they got together and got the wagons together and got the guns together. And they were going over to Cibolo to get the kids back. They said by the time they got to Cibolo, she told that all the Comanches were drunk. And the kids were just running around having a good time. So they just picked them up and put them in the wagon and came on back.
Good story. They let success go to their heads.
Well, I did come across some old letters where the people of Fredericksburg had sent a petition to, I don't know if it's the governor or the federal Indian agent, complaining about all the drunk Indians in this area, that they were a nuisance, and the governor wrote back that if the unprincipled people of town would stop selling them liquor, they wouldn't be drunk.
Why do you think that the children couldn't get away from the Indians? Why did they escape?
Oh, that's a very good question. Why the kids didn't try harder to escape, and it's the main reason is because during the getaway they covered a lot of ground fast, and they were kind of raiding on the northern edge of the frontier settlements in Texas. So within a few hours, they were out in country where there were no settlements. A lot of times there was no water. The Indians just knew where the water holes were, and so there was really no place for the kids to escape to. One of the best stories about that, if you're familiar with Herman Lehman's story, his brother Willie was also captured, fell off the horse in not too far from Eden is where that happened, and there was nothing out there at the time, and so he wandered alone for 3 or 4 days, an 8-year-old kid with no food or water, until a wagoneer happened to come by and find him and pick him up.
Wasn't the Indian livestock for children a little easier and they get run and play and do stuff? And they were back home, they were going to be working 12-hour days.
When I interviewed Mrs. Josephine Watt, that was Rudolph Fischer's granddaughter in Lawton, she said when she came back here for the Fischer family reunion that everybody laughed about how Rudolph went back to the Indians because he wanted an easier life. And it is true, the early families here, the kids had to work, very young. I know in my family that I wrote about here, the Corns, they were hiring out their kids to work for other families when they were 10 years old. So, the kids never got to go to school. It was just from a very early age. They either worked for their parents or somebody else. And so I think that's one of the things, especially the boys, really responded to is instead of, hoeing the field every day, they were out riding and hunting and raiding and whatever else. Well, that was all I had, unless anybody else has a story. Thank you very much.
Wasn't that great?
That
Yeah.
Good time. Yes, thank you. We have a story here.
I just want to tell you how I have enjoyed your meeting so much, and hopefully I'll see you again.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful, Patty. Did someone get her picture? She's our winner for the oldest person.
I didn't get one by herself, but I got a group picture.
Okay, good. Well, a couple of years ago, when I first was introduced to Scott's book, I went in Fredericksburg to see if I could find a copy of it, and they were all sold out, and so I went to my sister and borrowed her book and took it with me. When we left here, we were on our way to Arizona, so we drove up the road and out towards the west and north in Texas. And as I was reading the book about Herman Lehman and his little brother, who was captured at the same time, and how he kind of got lost and wandered around, and I was in the same area where they might have been, and I'm looking out, and there's still nothing there. It's really desolate. And thinking, what would it have been like? There was no highway like we were on, but